Reverend, what, Professor or Reverend? How would you like to be called?
John Jones.
John, okay, John Jones. He will start the new year off on the topic sports ethics. I didn't do this deliberately, but last year on January 4th, you also began. You spoke on advertising ethics from the 50s to the 90s. So God willing, you're starting another year for us, and it should be a good year for all. And I do appreciate your coming back to speak on this. Before we begin, please let me thank all of my fellow librarians for all their help and support for all these programs. I couldn't do it without their help, and I want to thank them. Nancy, Catherine, Jill, Mary, Frank, Sarah, everyone, thank you. It's funny, we're 1997. Since this program began in 1986, we're entering it in 1997. I don't think any of you look any older. So it shows you what happens when you learn and you have great professors to listen to. You get younger. See? So please, that's the important thing, right? Anyway, let's give a warm welcome to our very good friend and special guest, Professor Phyllis Kalb. Thank you for coming.
First, let me say something of a personal nature about my interest in sports. I come by my interest in sports primarily from my father, who grew up in eastern South Dakota. Huron, South Dakota was his home, and even though he was a farm boy, he went to Huron High School, where he was in track and field. He was a discus thrower, a high jumper, a long jumper. He threw the javelin. He played football, and he played basketball. And I followed in his steps, and even went to South Dakota State College, and eventually graduated from Augustana, which is a Lutheran college in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where I played Division II football. We did have a few people in my era who went into the professional ranks. Some of you may know, if you're football fans, Pete Retzlaff, who played for the Philadelphia Eagles. He was running back when Norm Van Brocklin was the quarterback. And Doug Agers played for the Baltimore Colts. He was a linebacker, and a few others. So that's my minor claim to fame, is I played both defensive and offensive end in football. My generation was about the time that we had a division of labor. That is, you begin to have an offensive team and a defensive team. And so when I was in college, I ended up in my senior year being an offensive end. And then I played basketball, and I did track. I ran the hurdles and the 400 meter. And so I come about my interest in sports primarily through my father. And I've always been active. I play tennis, once a week during the winter and whenever I can during the summer. But I'm now at the end of my playing days. I have a bad knee. I have my orthopedic sports medicine doctor did an arthroscopic look at it back in 1988 and told me that I had no cartilage. It was just bone on the ball and socket, and plus some arthritis. And so as long as it's a bad knee and I'm going to need a new one anyway someday, I just decided to keep playing on it. So I take 4 Advils an hour before I play tennis, and then drive off to Murray Hill, the tennis club. Right. Anyway, I was actually scheduled for a new knee January 9th, and when I told my doctor that I had been invited to teach in Auckland, New Zealand at the Auckland Institute of Technology, and was leaving for Auckland for the spring term on February 12th, he told me that there was not enough time to monitor do the post-operative monitoring. And what was interesting to me about that, this is medical ethics, is, I teach medical ethics, and I teach my students about informed consent and patients' rights and patients' autonomy, and how important it is to get all the information you can about symptoms, after the operation. And I had 2 consultations with my doctor, and he focused on the operation itself and the prosthesis, and he focused on the physical rehabilitation afterwards, the moving of the knee and the various things I would have to do. But he never told me about the possibility of clotting until I told him that I was going to New Zealand, and he calculated the timing, and he said, I would want to see you about 6 times after the operation to using a Doppler technique to check on clotting to prevent strokes, or it could even be fatal. And it occurred to me that my doctor probably wasn't going to tell me that. And not out of any malfeasance or, but I think it's probably inadvertent, that he probably didn't think that was very important to me, that as long as the doctor knew it, that was enough. But anyway, so I put it off until July. Now, what does this have to do with our topic? Well, I am a professor of applied social ethics. I've always been a sports participant and a fan. I'm a hapless, and I underscore hapless, New York Jets fan. But it's character building to be a Jets fan. But 4 years ago, I engaged in a project which was to develop a bibliography on sports ethics. It had never been done before in America. I had a graduate assistant, a woman, PhD student, who agreed to help me with it. And the result is this book called Sports Ethics in America, a Bibliography. It's not a book you're going to sit down and read, but it's a reference book. It has well over 3,000 items covering the field of sports ethics in about the last 20 years in the United States. This forced me into various libraries, and it forced me to become acquainted with various journals like the History of Sport in America, Sociology of Sport, Anthropology of Sport, Sport in the Ancient World, Sport and Classics, like the ancient Olympiad. And so I became acquainted with academic material that focused on something that I loved just as an avocation, as a hobby. And so I then combined my lifelong interest, my love of sports, with my academic life, my academic interests. So I joined those two. And one of the results of this book and my getting immersed in it, it took 2 years to gather all the data for this, was to develop a course in sports ethics at Drew University. And so I'm going to start out by just quickly telling you what the discipline of sports ethics looks like. The way I carve up the course, or divide up the course, is to look at the 3 environments of sport. It's the same way I teach business ethics. In business ethics, I look at the micro environment, that is the firm or the corporation itself, and all of the ethical issues that have to do internally with the firm, like performance evaluation and the issues of fairness, the affirmative action issues, the justice issues, the quality of work-life, workplace safety, a whole host of issues. Those of you who've been in business know that there are many, many issues that just emerge out of life in the corporation. The second environment of business is the marketplace. the relationship with competitors and vendors and suppliers and regulators. The third large environment of business, of course, is society itself, the macro environment, where we have larger issues of environment and the perennial issues of minority relations and race relations, and then the role of advertising, as we discussed last year, would be a macro societal issue. Well, when I thought of sports, I thought of the same thing. What are the main environments of sport? And so I discerned at least three environments of sport. The primary environment is the team, or the athlete, if it's an individual or dual sport. But if it's a team sport, and so the issues of the relationship between team members with each other, team members and coaches, even trainers. There's one book on the ethics of, not trainers, but equipment managers. The equipment managers, have quite a bit of power. They're the ones that pass out the uniforms, and it's interesting what they can do with that power. But I was shocked to see that there was a whole book devoted to the ethics of sports equipment managers. The second environment of sport, of course, is the contest or the game. The relationship with the other team, the relationship with referees or umpires or various officials, the relationship to fans, and then fan behavior itself is an ethical issue. I very frankly am ashamed of my fellow Jets fans for just being jerks, almost weekly. I mean, they boo their own players, and they even booed Kenny O'Brien once. He was the quarterback, and he was knocked out of the game with an injury and had to be carried off, and they were cheering, but when he came back on the field, able to play, they booed him. I mean, it's just ridiculous, and I'm no big fan of their former coach, Rich Kotite, but I think there's some role for relating to the game in terms of human dignity. I mean, people are human beings. Bad coaches are still human beings and should be treated as such. I get into arguments all the time with my students about booing, booing your own team. I don't mind booing officials when they make bad calls. But, I say, how would it be if I went to a women's basketball game at Drew University and one of my students missed a bucket or failed to dive for a ball, which could have saved the game, and I stood up and started booing, boo, Sally, boo. Or if I booed my own son when he was playing soccer and if he happened to, miss a kick. I mean, it would be unseemly. But somehow, when you go to Giants Stadium, there seems to be a different canon of what is right and wrong. And it, very frankly, it does bother me. All right, the third environment, there are a whole host of issues centering around this second environment, the contest. The third environment is, of course, macro society. And many of those issues, of course, have to do with major problems in our society. One of the more interesting topics in sports ethics is race relations. In some ways, it parallels our own history in the United States. Most of you remember the Jackie Robinson story, the integration of baseball. And it's a very interesting academic question as to what extent baseball was following what was happening in society, or to what extent baseball actually played a role in the civil rights movement, which is the greatest social revolution this country has ever experienced. Did sports follow, or did sports lead? Well, a little bit of both. It took a long time for basketball to even catch up with the country on civil rights. Adolph Rupp of the University of Kentucky was one of the most self-avowed racist coaches, ever to have that kind of a job in the United States. I remember back in 1967, he took his team to the finals of the NCAA, and that year, Southern Texas, which is an all-black, all African-American school, and this year, incidentally, they played Howard University on a couple days ago, and they have a white quarterback. There was a big article in the Star-Ledger about the controversy. Who won that game? Does anyone know? It was a fairly tight game, and then I got distracted and left. Think Howard did?
Not sure. Watching the game. I was amazed at that white quarterback. It was a little unusual.
But you don't know who won the game?
Who they play? Howard.
Yeah, okay. But anyway, in 1967, an all-black team from Southern Texas, I think they may have had a couple of white guys sitting on the bench, went to the finals and played Kentucky. And Adolph Rupp had said, and this really sounds strange in our day, but he said, there's no black team, no bunch of niggers who could ever beat white boys in basketball. At that time, they had no clue how much talent African Americans could have because of segregation and also poverty. There weren't many black athletes in 1940, 50, and the early 60s because it was an apartheid system in the South. I mean, Ralph Sampson could not have gone to the University of Virginia in 1950 or early 60s. Civil Rights Act was 1964, and this was 1967, 3 years after the Civil Rights Act, and there were no black basketball players for Kentucky. It was just beginning to change. What I'd like to do now is, that was my little introduction to the discipline of sports ethics, is to suggest a simple thesis and then try to illustrate it. The thesis is that sport is both a mirror of our culture and especially of our problems and a reflection of some of our values and the myths of our own self-identification as Americans. So those are two parts. One, I'm going to just suggest what some of the problems are that are reflective of the larger problems in our society. And then I'm going to focus on some values in sports that I think reflect American values, at least in terms of our own self-identification. And then at the end, I'd like to point out what I think are some good things about sport in America, and then we can have a little discussion. Did any of you happen to read Jerry Eisenberg's column in the Star-Ledger about inspiring sports stories of the year of 1996? We can close on that. Close on that. What's that? No, it's 2 days ago. Yeah, it was. It was a New Year's Eve day, right? All right. My assumption is that maybe not in every society, but in most societies, you could find a window into their cultures by looking at the meaning of sport in their particular societies. I'm kind of anxious to look at the meaning and the role of rugby in New Zealand. That is the main sport in New Zealand, and it's almost like a civil religion to them. I mean, it provides what religion provides. It provides meaning, it provides cohesion, connectedness, it provides inspiration, It's sport, of course, is also an opening to the human condition. We discover what humanity is like by participating and observing in sport, sports. I'm not sure about every culture. I'm acquainted with Australia to the extent that I think I could say something about Australian rules football, and not what it means to Australia on the whole, but to Australian men. And I think the kind of sport it is reflective of something about characteristics of Australian men. But I do think that sport in America is reflective of some of our larger problems and may point to something about our character. Just consider, I'm just going to tick off some of the problems in sports that are also problems in our larger societies. Violence comes to mind immediately as a major problem in sports, and it even starts in high school. I recall 2 years ago, there were stories about high school football teams out in California, sort of north of Santa Barbara, or south of Santa Barbara, in that area, where the athletic directors finally decided to stop the ritual handshaking after a game, where the teams come up and shake each other's hand and go through a line, because there were too many fights breaking out at the end of the game. And then to cancel that ritual is also terrible, because it's sort of acceding to the behavior rather than teaching them what proper behavior is. I mean, they capitulated to this gross behavior rather than using sport as an occasion to teach sportsmanship and character building. As we are gathered here right now, probably, police in Dallas are interviewing 2 Dallas Cowboys, Michael Irvin and Eric Williams, about possible sexual molestation or abuse, a possible rape. And there are indications that it might be on a camcorder, and the evidence could be right there. I'll come back to this. Drug use is a problem in sports. Both performance-enhancing drugs and then the Michael Irvin kind. He was caught with cocaine. That isn't performance-enhancing, that's recreational. And we all know that in our society, and this isn't confined to inner cities, it's in the suburbs, and it's in the Upper East Side in New York City, and that's the drug problem in our country. Racism still exists in our society. It exists in different ways in sports, especially in the management side. And some claim that there's what they call stacking, that blacks get the running jobs and the drudgery jobs in the line, and whites get the cognitive jobs, quarterbacking. I'm not sure about that. There is some debate about that. Although, on the other hand, I think that in many ways, sports may be one of the most integrated subcultures in our national life. Ideally, it should be, because sports is a meritorian behavior, where you want your best players, regardless of whether they're Asian or Native American or African American or what. And I think that may be the issue at Southern, where the coach thought this young white man was the best quarterback he had. And that's the way it should work. That's the way it should work in business too, but it doesn't always happen that way. Sexism. One of the large ethical issues has to do with gender equity, especially in Division 3, 2, and 1 intercollegiate athletics. Very frankly, there will never be complete gender equity as long as football and basketball, male football and basketball in Division I schools exist the way it exists now. As long as there is money to be made by winning football and basketball teams, the women's lacrosse teams and the crew teams and the tennis teams will take not only an uneasy second place, but a third, fourth, and fifth place. Even though in the Civil Rights Act we have Title IX that requires and mandates gender equity in terms of equal opportunity. And yet, women basketball players in Division II schools and some Division I schools will take vans or buses to games, and the men will take airplanes. If they, like the Yukon women, if they come down to Pennsylvania or New Jersey, will come down in the bus, and the men will charter an airplane and fly in. So anyway, there's a lot written about that issue. Brown University just went through a very tough legal battle where women brought charges against the school for not complying with Title IX, and Brown lost, and the women won in that case. Gambling is another national problem. We don't hear a lot about it, but I did hear a little documentary on, or a debate on television the other day. I think it was on CNN, that indicated that I think every state but two now has legalized gambling in the United States. Utah, the Mormons are keeping it out, and I forget what the other state was. But everybody has lotteries, and that New York State is going to go into legalized gambling. They'll have gambling in, casinos in Buffalo shortly. Gambling in sports, it used to be probably more of a problem than it is now, but it's still a problem. We remember Pete Rose was heavy into gambling. There's some evidence that Michael Jordan, not betting on his own team, but did have somewhat of a gambling problem. He gambles on his own golf. Boston College this year had to pull several of their players for being involved in gambling on their own games. My next point, I think, is a major one, and that is the role of the media in sport. It has literally changed the kind of entertainment that it is. Advertising, Nike is a powerful role in what's happening, I think, not for good in American sports. But we know that the media, especially television, has reshaped American life. It's, many of you, as I do, remember when we didn't have television. And life was different. And so just as the media is reshaping American culture, it is reshaping American sport. And then related to this, of course, is the role of money in American sport, and especially intercollegiate sport, and certainly professional sports. It's, if you want to look at why there are no longer the Cleveland Browns in Cleveland. Do you want more heat in here? Is that? Oh.
Frank, could you close the window? It's too cold. It's cold. Excuse me? Can you close it? Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
He opened up a window and there's a drip.
Well, the reason there is not the Cleveland Browns anymore is that Art Modell asked the city of Cleveland if they would build him a new stadium. And then, of course, he is reaping the profits, and Cleveland will get a little cash flow out of that. And Cleveland decided they wouldn't do it, and so he just picked up his team and moved to Boston, and now they are the Baltimore Ravens. And of course, it just decimates a great part of the history of professional football. The Cleveland Browns were there at the creation. One of the early teams, like the Green Bay Packers and the Bears and the Browns and the Colts and the Giants, of course. It's the reason why we no longer have the Baltimore Colts, because their boss, late at night, pulled up two large tractor-trailer trucks and put all the equipment in, and in a stealth-like move, slipped out of Baltimore and went to Indianapolis. Huge sums of money are reshaping American sports. All right, let me just focus in on four problems. You know, I mentioned violence as a major problem in sport. And the violence, of course, is both on the fields and in the courts and off the field and in society itself. The number of, there was also an article in the New York Times op-ed section sometime last week about this. Someone has just written a book about violence off the field in sports. But we remember last year there were two University of Nebraska football players who were charged with abusing women. Kevin Phillips, who was their leading player running back, was accused, and it was accused of a criminal act, which was to grab his girlfriend by the hair, pull her down a flight of stairs, and then slam her into a mailbox, and ending up with bruises and cuts. And Coach Osborne of the University of Nebraska reinstated him and gave the reason is he will have a better chance for rehabilitation in the controlled environment of the sports world than if we kick him off the team. And what's interesting, and there was a charge against another Nebraska football team, but what was really at stake was Nebraska had a chance to win a national championship. If they won the national championship, that meant at minimum $8 million and possibly $10 million when you count up all the revenues. So that even the president, who was a woman of the University of Nebraska, did not protest this. The faculty did not protest this. The culture of the University of Nebraska is a football culture, and so they overlooked these criminal acts. And then you have nice guys, allegedly, like Warren Moon, who was charged with bashing his wife. Robert Parrish, the former Celtic, and now I don't know who he plays for, but anyway, he was a wife basher. The Oklahoma dormitory under Barry Switzer was a zoo. Those football players were rapists, they were drug dealers, there was a murder, and that's why Barry Switzer got finally kicked out of the University of Oklahoma. They kept him because he was a winning coach. And they overlooked this for years, what went on in that locker room. So violence is one of the serious problems in American sports. There is a big literature on the question of whether or not controlled violence, like young boys who play football, whether that gets it out of their system and once they get in then to regular society, they go into their classrooms or homes or whatever, are they nicer because they got it out of their system? Or the other side is, do they learn to be violent in sport and macho and sexist, telling dirty jokes in the locker room? And is there a carryover so that they're better at being violent, dirty joke tellers, and objectifying women once they get out? And I think the best evidence is the latter, although there is an intellectual debate about that. All right. The exploitation of athletes and academics is another problem. And this is a huge problem in Division I, high-powered sports programs. I'll just give you 2 or 3 examples. Mississippi State did not graduate a black basketball player in a decade. A whole decade of being a top-notch basketball program, but not graduating one of their players. Some of you will remember Dexter Manley, who played tackle for the Washington Redskins. He graduated from Oklahoma State and had to confess before a House committee looking at sports and academics and that issue. And his lawyer prepared some notes for him, and he looked down, and all of a sudden tears welled up in his eyes. And Senator Paul Simon, with the bow tie from Illinois, said, "Dexter, don't feel bad, and don't feel you have to read that. Just speak from your heart. Tell us what you know about your experience." And Dexter Manley, this 280-pound rough tackle, was sobbing when he admitted that he did not know how to read. He did not know how to read. His reading was at a less than 5-year-old level. He had to go to school after pro football to learn how to read. His life is a total mess now. For a while, he was on the up and up, but he was also addicted to drugs, and he has lost all of his money, and he is a homeless person. But just imagine what kind of an educational system it is, and what football means to that system when a player can go first year, second year, third year, and be a graduating senior and not know how to read a simple sentence. It means that it's systemic, that a whole culture allows these players to go through. And what they are farm teams. You can theoretically play football in this country and basketball without going to college, but it's very, very difficult. I mean, just think of how unusual it is. The value we attach to sports in universities. I mean, just imagine the University of Paris having a football team and 60,000 people coming out to watch them play Oxford.
Do they have a team?
No, they don't have a team. Nobody in the world has football teams that are attached to universities. They have club teams in Europe. And they're semi-pro or they're club. I've been to Australia, the University of Western Australia, 4 times. And they play cricket, and they play rugby, and Australian rules football, and soccer. And there's a little bit of inter-varsity, that is on Saturdays, they'll go out to the field and play Monash University or another school. But there are no spectators. It's mainly the boys and the girls going out having fun on a Saturday afternoon. It's only in the United States. Baseball is a little different. You can get into baseball without going to college. But really, we have a farm system, and the issue of academics is one of the tougher ones. Third one is recruiting. That's a major problem in sports, and it's even filtered down now into the high schools. Let me just give you an illustration of that. Nike has a summer basketball program in Chicago. They bring high school basketball players, men, from all over the country. Then high school coaches come and watch these players play, and college coaches come because they're, in the recruiting business. And so it is a huge meat market. And these are 16-year-old kids, 17-year-old kids. And what happens is, and I'll just give you one illustration of what happens, and that is there's a case where a Southside Chicago high school basketball coach saw this one young kid, an African American from South Carolina, and he talked to him, got his mother's phone number, flew the mother up from South Carolina to Chicago, got her a nice room in a hotel, and said, "I'd like your boy to come to my school. It would mean you moving to Chicago, but he's going to get better TV exposure in Chicago. He'll have a better chance of getting a college scholarship." And that's what happened. And I saw on television the interview with his own coach down in South Carolina, who was looking forward to his senior year where he might go to the state tournament. And so high school kids are being stolen from high schools. The recruiting business is a real mess, even though the NCAA tries to monitor it. But offering good young athletes automobiles, wining and dining them, money under the table. SMU actually provided women for young high school boys for a fun weekend if they would come to SMU. Of course, SMU got sanctioned. They could not participate in football for something like 3 years. And then finally, I come back to the last problem that I'll mention, and that is the role of big money. I mentioned that the reason I think Nebraska overlooked the criminal acts of two of their players is because they had a chance to win the national championship, and that meant $8 to $10 million. Each basketball team that makes the cut, the 64 team cut in the March Madness tournament, automatically gets $400,000. Now, I know what that means. $400,000 may not mean a lot to the University of Michigan, although $400,000 is a lot. It would mean an awful lot to Drew University, I can tell you that. So, I mean, that related to the media, the importance of being on television, having advertising is a huge, huge problem. But think of the role of money in professional baseball and football and basketball. How much money Neil O'Donnell got to come from the Pittsburgh Steelers to my team, $25 million for 5 years. That means $5 million a year, but with a $7 million signing bonus. So he just got $7 million up front. He played 5 games this year. Someone calculated that I think he threw 4 touchdowns or something, that each touchdown was worth about $2 million. And is it really worth it? All right. I'm going to close with, by now focusing on the second issue. I said that I thought sport in American society mirrored the problems of our society, but I think it also reflects some of our values. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 4 slogans that typically appear on locker room walls or bulletin boards, or that appear in coaches' motivational speeches, and suggest that it reveals what we think of ourselves as a society. The first one is about winning. And we all have heard this slogan. Winning isn't everything, it is the only thing. Vince Lombardi, of the Green Bay Packers, and he's a New Jerseyan, I think. Americans, isn't it true that Americans think of themselves as winners? It was the problem with the Vietnam War. We had never lost a war. And now we were about to lose a war. It was a bad war in many different ways. But the worst way for most Americans is that it was an unwinnable war. And Americans love to watch people win. We love to watch the Emmy Awards, Miss America contest, Super Bowls, spelling bees. We are a nation that really does like competition, and we like to identify winners, and we like to identify ourselves as winners. We take it for granted a statement that is made all the time in our country, and that is, America is the greatest nation in the world. Politicians, sprinkle their speeches with that slogan. Now, just what do you think people in France think when they hear Americans, claim we're the greatest nation in the world? What do people in England think? Well, I'll tell you what someone in New Zealand thought. My former president, Paul Hardin, who preceded Tom Kane as president of Drew University, wrote a letter in a Drew alumni magazine, and in the letter, in his little talk to the alums in the magazine, he said something like, we want Drew to graduate students who will help America continue to become the greatest nation in the world. Well, my friend, John Hinchcliffe, who is the president of the university that I'm going to teach in, told me that he wrote back. He's an alumnus, an alum of Drew University. He got his PhD there at the same time I did. And he wrote back to Paul Hardin, and he said, as a New Zealander, he said, do you know what this sounds like when you're in another country, another nation? And then he began to lecture President Hardin about the role of liberal arts. He said, don't you think a liberal arts education has more to do than making the United States the greatest country in the world? Like becoming a complete whole person. So anyway, I think that that's the emphasis of winning in sports is reflected in our wider society. A second slogan is, no one ever drowned in sweat. This refers to the work ethic that Americans embrace. It is a common slogan that coaches put on bulletin boards and in their motivational speeches, because we place a high value on the work ethic, and that derives, according to scholars, especially Max Weber, the German sociologist who wrote a book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, it derives from our Puritan Protestant heritage, where the way you please God is to go out into the fields and work from dawn till dusk as hard as you can, and you will be rewarded. We still have a work ethic. Some people take it to extremes and become workaholics. They don't know how to relax. But it's clearly coaches want to tap into that part of the American character, and they want to inculcate the work ethic. And of course, the more successful athletes become, the harder they work, and the more sport, which is really play. I mean, the ideal of sport has to do with having fun. It's playing. We play golf. We play tennis. Why do we play? It's the same reason little children say, I'm going out to play, to have fun. But in our country, sports sometimes lapses over into work. And it's a combination. But comparing Americans with other countries, like the Australians have a much higher tolerance for recreation, I think, than we do. I mean, it's like in England, they close their stores Saturday noon. You can shop Saturday morning, but not afternoon. You can hardly find gas because you can't find gas stations open. They have this quota system where they'll have one petroleum station open to cover a whole suburb. And you have to know where that is on a given weekend. They play tennis, they have Barbies, they have picnics. And they're not as successful as we are. We do happen to be a very successful nation in terms of industry and entrepreneurial activity and making money. Another slogan, never give up. It's another common slogan found on locker room walls. And when I hear that phrase, never give up, I think of Jimmy Valvano, who coached the North Carolina state basketball team to a national championship. They were underdogs. The slogan, I think, reflects our own interest and love of underdogs overcoming adversity. It's the comeback kid syndrome. We love comeback kids. And of course, Bill Clinton wraps himself in the mantle of comeback kid. Twice he's done it now. Because he knows it's an American, it has to do with American sensitivities. But I think of Jimmy Valvano standing before a crowded gymnasium at the University of, at North Carolina State in Charlotte, dying of cancer. He's a New Jersey boy too. And he's out there reflecting on that game. That was the highlight of his life. It's the epitome. And he was, as he was dying, he would say, never, never, never give up. But I think, don't you think Americans feel this way? That no matter how tough things are going, that we can rise above it? It has to do with the Horatio Alger myth, that has to do with our self-identification. There's another slogan that taps into this, and that is, that coaches like to use, it's not the size of the dog in the fight, but the size of the fight in the dog. And then finally, and this relates to my first point about winning, but it's a unique point that I want to close with, and that is, Americans have an emphasis on outcomes rather than process. Consider the following slogan: close only counts in horseshoes. That when an American asks, and there would be exceptions of course, but when you ask about a game, the question is, did you win? Or who won? We're not interested in second place. We're not interested in ties. We're not interested in, did you have fun? Was it a good game? See, those are process questions. Those of us who play just recreationally, golf or tennis or whatever, we might ask the question, like my wife might ask, did you have fun tonight? As a matter of fact, she doesn't care whether I win or lose, but she's unusual in that respect. Let me tell you a little story about my New Zealand friend, John Hinchcliffe, to illustrate the point. Back in around 1968-69, he and a South African, Alec Bahrain, who's a white South African, a Methodist minister, started a rugby club at Drew. And the second year, they had a team meeting. They were player coaches. And one of the men students said, what was our won-loss record last year? And John looked at him and said, I have no idea. We don't keep stats in rugby. He said, we may remember who won the game last week or maybe the week before, but that's not the purpose of club rugby sport. He said, the purpose of rugby is to go out and play as hard as you can and try to win, but it's to have fun. And then after it's all over, you sit down, you have some beers, you sing some songs, and you invite the women to join you, and you join the other team. And that's what rugby is about. It's about having fun. And so he was focusing on process, and he was coming closer to the ideal of sport than the Americans, who are so used to looking at the WL stats. George Allen, the former Washington Redskins coach, I think expressed the sentiment of many Americans and many sports fans when he said, losing is worse than death because you have to live with losing. Americans don't like ties. I'll tell you a little personal story about this in making my concluding remarks. I played high school football for Rapid City High School, which is out in the Black Hills, not far from Mount Rushmore. And we took a school bus and went on a trip to eastern South Dakota, to Watertown. It was about a 450-mile trip. And we played Watertown on a nice October evening to a 0-0 tie. It was a tough defensive game. And we had fun afterwards, going to a high school dance and meeting some of the Watertown high school girls, and got on our bus and came back to Rapid City. And Sunday afternoon late, my father was still reading the Sunday paper, and I walked in, and my dad said, "Who won?" And I said, "It was a tie, 0-0. And my dad could not believe it. He said, "You went all that way and only got a tie?" He said, "What a waste that was." Well, see, my dad is an American. He wants an outcome, and he wants a win. And I thought it was a very good game, and I was glad we didn't lose, very frankly. We were kind of afraid of those Easterners. But when professional soccer first came to America, it was typical in Europe, Central America, and South America that games frequently ended up 1-1 or even 0-0. Soccer games, as you know, are very low scoring. And so they could end up in a tie. And the officials of the soccer league, the American Soccer League, knew that Americans would be dissatisfied with ties. So they're the ones that came up with the scheme to have a shootout. That is, at the end of regulation time, if it was a tie, then each person from each team would get a chance to shoot against the goalie. And the first one to miss lost the game. So Americans could have their winner and their loser. In a contrasting culture, young men of the Tangu culture in New Guinea play a game called Take-A-Tack, T-A-K-E-T-A-C, Take-A-Tack, which cannot end until the score is tied. This is necessary in that culture because of sparse resources, where sharing of food and other necessities is an absolute requirement, or you couldn't survive. So they live in a culture of sharing and cooperation. And this is reflected in this particular game, where cooperation and sharing, even though they work hard and they're achieving excellence, somehow the game is constructed so that you just cannot end it until there's a tie. That's the rule. The point is, if you put one Tangu against another, and one Tangu beat another Tangu, it would tear at the fabric of that culture. It would be a shameful thing to do. And no Tangu would want to beat another Tangu at that price, at tearing at the fabric of their culture. America is different, as we know. Our highly competitive free market capitalism requires competition at the expense of others. Pepsi-Cola would like to beat out Coca-Cola in market share. Chrysler would like to beat out GM and Ford in market share. We place high value on competition, on winning, on outcomes. And these values are part of the American fabric, and these are the values that are expressed and reflected in American sports. Now, do we have any time for discussion?
Oh, I hope so.
I mean, it's 5 after 2.
And thank you so much. It was fascinating. I know everyone has questions, so if you'd like to start it.
Or you can make comments too, I don't care. Go ahead.
I was always pleased with the replay in football, but they don't have replay in baseball, especially in the World Series, where there were four calls by the umpires. There was no replay to see your opinion.
Yeah, well, I like replays. I think the issue is if they can be as good as the major television broadcasting replays are. I mean, ABC, NBC, Fox, they know how to do it, and so we get to see the playback right away. I don't know what these guys were doing up in the booth for 5 minutes, poring over a replay when we sitting out in television land knew if it was in or out. So I think it's a matter of being efficient in doing it. You know, I'm not for taking a lot of time doing it, but if you can do it efficiently, you know, I was watching a game last night. It was Arizona State. It was a good game, but the first touchdown by Arizona State was not a touchdown. This guy came down, the ball hit the ground and popped out, and they got 6 points. I mean, see, this brings up an ethics issue, and that is a game is not an authentic game if it's unfair. And if an official makes a wrong call, then it's not a game. Even though officials will claim it is. A few years ago, Missouri was playing some team, and they got 5 downs. They didn't realize that they had just run their 4th down, and on the 5th down, they got a touchdown, and they won the game. See, that's like Ben Johnson using steroids to beat Carl Lewis. That's cheating. It's not a game. And people out in Deadwood, South Dakota used to get shot for cheating in poker. I mean, yeah. Oh, this is the baseball player, Alomar, Roberto Alomar. Oh, yeah, I think that is horrendous, and I think he should have been jerked. I mean, not allowed to play, and I think his own manager should have done it, and not waited for the baseball commissioner, who wasn't going to do it. No, that's another thing that really sullies sport. And just think, I mean, the question of should athletes be role models? I mean, what this tells young high school, I don't think they should either. I mean, they should behave themselves, but as a society, we shouldn't encourage that. What do you think of that? Yeah, I mean, it's amazing the restraint of that official, not punching him right back. Go ahead.
Last night, Charlie Rose had political cartoonists on, and one of them, came to this point, they have the umpire in a balloon, and it was the guy is spinning, and anyway, somebody's in like what do you call that? The contagion thing in the bubble. It was really very played out.
Okay, yes, here.
Mine might be two. The first one You said they paid 25 million and 7 million. Do they make such huge profits that they can have the money to do that?
The question is, she remarked on the 25 million that Neil O'Donnell got and the 7 million signing bonus to come. And her question is, do they make enough profits or that much profit so they can do it? And the answer is yes. Leon Hess is a billionaire. He owns the Jets. But he makes money on the Jets whether they win or lose. He would make more if they won through advertising and things like that. But every seat is sold out for years. I cannot get a season ticket to the New York Jets. My only hope is to buy it from someone who's stopped going to games and wants to get rid of them.
Now, this is a complete reversal. When you spoke about the ticket tunes, isn't that the name, where they have to share it?
Yeah, the Tongus, right.
Does that relate to war? Does that mean they don't fight each other?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a very good question, and I don't know the answer to that. Well, she was reflecting on this Tongu culture, and she was asking if that transfers over to the question of war. Do they fight? And I don't know. I honestly don't. As a matter of fact, I'm going to find out. I'll tell Phyllis. Yes.
Speaking of violence, I noticed that in the game of ice hockey, there's a tremendous amount of violence, and the referees stand around and don't seem to try to stop it for a long time. Can you explain that?
Yeah, well, I went to a Rangers Flyers game earlier this year. I'm not a big hockey fan. And it was actually pretty mild. It was actually pretty boring. The Flyers won. And I didn't see a lot of that, although it is, it is true that is a very brutal sport. And some people have said, well, there have been a couple of suggestions to reduce the violence in hockey. One is to have a police officer right down next to the rink, and when someone slams someone else, to charge him with assault and battery. I mean, they're citizens, they're American citizens. What makes the rink so special? And some sports writers suggested that in Boston. A friend of mine was a Neiman Fellow at Harvard in journalism and told me the story about one sports writer who was deploring the amount of violence in hockey, made this suggestion that when someone takes a stick and hits another person with a stick, they should be charged with battery, assault and battery. And the rest of the sports writers in Boston laughed him almost out of town. Nobody agreed with him. The other suggestion is to make the helmets less safe, and the uniforms themselves, because some people think the reason there's violence is because they have all of these pads on. And if you didn't have helmets, then it would be in everybody's interest to be a little nicer to each other on the court. But I want to make another point about violence. And I remember talking with a friend of mine who teaches ethics at Harvard. And we're both football fans. And I asked him, I said, why do you think we like football? And he said, well, we should be ashamed of ourselves, Jones, but one of the reasons is the violence. The human beings do have, I think, an interest in violence. I think it's the interest that little children have in Grimm's fairy tales. There's violence in most nursery rhymes, Humpty Dumpty, whatever, and the scary stories about the witch and Hansel and Gretel. You have death and murder. I mean, Jack and the Beanstalk. You've got stealing, and you've got killing. And at the end of the story, everybody's happy except the giant. But I think, and I remember, I used to say the little prayer, now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep, and if I should die before I wake. I'm a 4-year-old kid saying, the specter of death is before me before I'm tucked in. But Unlike hockey, football is the only game, well, football and boxing are the only two sports where violence is a part of the strategy. In boxing, it's not only the strategy, but it's the end, it's the outcome, knocking the other person out. In football, it's hitting the person as hard as you can. That's not an end in itself. Scoring the touchdown is the end. But, and so I guess what I'm saying is that fans like violence, and the perception on hockey is that you would have fewer fans if we're less violent. I don't know if that's true or not. Okay, thanks.
Some years ago,
Wait,
when I
wait,
was in
I-
Amsterdam, after a soccer game, all these people came, and we were in the hotel, they were turning the cars over. Terrible violence after the
Well,
game.
yeah, fans can be violent
And you hear
too.
that all the time after soccer games.
Yeah, it's the underside of sports. I mean, there's no question about it. Although I think European soccer fans can be more violent than American football fans. I mean, the Giants fans throwing snowballs at the players, ice balls, is a bad show. But yes.
Professor, speaking of boxing, when the objective of that, in quotes, sport is to disable your opponent, is it possible indeed it ought to be outlawed?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's a bad sport. And I grew up, as a little kid listening to Billy Conn and Joe Louis fights and Max Schmeling, and when my dad would be working on the car, he'd have the radio on, and but I was a little kid and it was far removed, and but when I gotten into the study, and and then you look at Muhammad Ali, which in some ways was an inspiring story of this year of how, and Eisenberg pointed that out in his column. As here's a man who is overcoming his physical malady by virtually willing to put that torch and hold it while he's shaking it. So that's a positive thing about it. But the tragedy is that he's disabled, and because of his sport. It's the reason Al Toon quit football a little earlier than he had to. Al Toon will always be bothered by concussion problems. And Joe Montana, who knows what's happened to his brain. I mean, he's all right, but Joe Namath will always be a cripple because of his knees. But I know, what do you think about boxing?
Oh, I think undoubtedly it should be contrary to law.
Yeah, I mean, genuine wrestling is much more of a humane sport than boxing.
Since there are so many of these questionable things that I agree with what you outlined there, isn't there an obligation in the world of education, and I'm thinking particularly of the presidents of college, particularly of former Governor Kane at Drew, to take a leadership role in trying to get colleges and education out of the professional sports money business?
Yeah, I think it is. But I tell you, it's so lucrative. I have a friend who is the president of the University of Texas at Austin. He's the most unlikely president you can imagine. He went to Augustana College when I did. He's an evangelical Norwegian Lutheran, Robert Berdahl. And he is a scholar. He's an intellectual historian. He ended up as a provost at the University of Illinois. And he dislikes football, unlike me. I like football. But he has to survive the hype down in Texas. Talk about religion. High school football, Friday night lights. It's a religion in these small towns all over Texas, small and big. But the University of Texas, the revenues that sport brings in makes it difficult for the president to do anything. One, he's got a board of trustees, and they're all fanatics about that team. And it's just difficult for presidents to stand against, the zeitgeist of football.
the University of Chicago discontinued football.
Yeah. You know, in little schools, Haverford discontinued football a number of years ago. NYU did. Columbia tried to get it back. And Seton Hall, it doesn't have football. What did you think of Seton Hall hiring this ringer from Australia, Andrew Glaze?
Disgusting. He came in for the season.
Came in for the season, and then as soon as the season's over, he left and played for a pro team in Australia.
Do the colleges actually make money on
Well, the winners make money. If you don't win, football is a very expensive sport, so they tend to spend most of the revenues.
Because I was thinking.
See, my guess is this year Penn State probably didn't make money. But the fact that Joe Paterno allowed his players to have the Nike logo on their jerseys probably meant an infusion of something like $15 to $2 million.
Why is that to lower the tuition?
Yeah, they could, but they don't. The other question is, could they use it to provide money for a new arts center? The answer is they don't. It would take a very courageous president to go against the Booster Club and the Board of Trustees to try to take control of the athletic department. Let's close, but let me just tell you another Paul Hardin story, my former president. Before he was president of Drew University, he was president of SMU, Southern Methodist University. And it is a Methodist school. They have a seminary there, Perkins Theological School. Paul Hardin is the son of a Methodist bishop. Bishop Hardin was a Southerner and was bishop in Mississippi and Alabama when Martin Luther King was doing his thing down there. But anyway, young Paul Hardin from Wofford College in South Carolina went to SMU, and his second year there, he got wind that there were some NCAA violations, recruiting violations especially. He went to his athletic director and says, your football coach is violating NCAA regulations, and outlined what he thought was the case, but said, I want you to investigate it and come and report to me, and if anything bad is going on, I want you to put a stop to it. Well, the athletic director went to some member of the board and said, get him off our back. You want a winning football team? Get him off our back. So nothing was done. So Paul Hardin then went directly to the football coach and told him to clean up his act or he's out of there. He's getting fired. And the football coach told him to go to hell and said, you run the university, I run the football team. And when Hardin had a meeting with a small group on the board, he said, I thought I was the president of the entire university, including the athletic program. And they said, no, you are the president of the academic part of the university. Leave athletics alone. And so he resigned. He took his big Cadillac that they gave him as a gift as the new president, drove it over to the chairman of the Board of Trustees' home. His wife followed him in a little Beetle Volkswagen. He walked up to the door, gave him the keys, said goodbye, jumped in the Beetle, and they left town. Went to University of Virginia, where he was teaching in the law school, and that's when Bishop Oxnam died. President Robert Oxnam, our president at that time, died of cancer. So we were without a president. And so this is the president we got, someone who exhibited moral courage as a president. This is just following your quote. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I hope you come back next year. Start our year with a great program. Yes, that'll be fascinating. Thank you. It's great having you.